This time on PedalBox, I'm building the roof and I'm working out how to get air from the outside into our intake. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our Patreon. Last episode we finished up by putting the exhaust in, and we've had all the parts for this for quite some time. We finally got it all built and immediately decided we weren't happy with it. As we mentioned at the end of previous episode, we were going to put in a 45-degree bend over here just to make the routing a little bit better, because originally it came across and then just sort of diagonally went across the back of the top of the box and into the inlet on the other side, which is all well and good, but it really didn't look right. We were really unhappy with the routing. It just looks kind of a bit haphazard more than anything. So we took some pieces out. We actually basically started from scratch so that we could also move the flexi from the turbo onto this side of the pipe. Now it all still moves around nicely, but now with the flexi not there, we can actually bolt the exhaust onto the housing. These two bolts at the front you could get a spanner on, but the one at the back you couldn't get a spanner or a socket in, so we kind of screwed ourselves over there, and that's why we had to move the flexi, and that meant disassembling the entire exhaust and pretty much starting over. So it doesn't quite look as pretty as it did before with just the nice individual little spot welds on, but it's definitely more functional, and once it's all properly welded up, it'll look way, way better. So now the exhaust's all done, we can look on to the much more fun part of this episode, which is looking at installing and fabricating a bit more of this roof bar. Now we don't want to be welding too much bodywork, or indeed any bodywork really, to the back of the car around here on the roll cage. So we've built this inch box and some 20mm box and some inch tube framework that sits over the top, which has a roof scoop in. So this is where we're going to be taking air into the engine bay, and it's basically going to dip down over here around the back and then go into the MAF on the other side. Now this has kind of evolved over 6-7 weeks, maybe a little bit more, just sort of moving on a little bit more and trying out a few different things. How far back does it want to sit? What angle does it want to go at? And a few other bits have kind of come because this was as much 1-inch tube as I actually had left, so it worked out quite nicely and it sort of forced my hand, but I do like how it's come out. Now there's more things we need to do before we can actually weld this onto the car though. The bodywork that goes across the top of here and the scoop that's going to come down into the back all need to be welded on and fabricated before this gets attached to the car, because I don't want to be doing that upside down under here or anything like that. Now we can 3D print an adapter to go from here down into our sort of panel filter or whatever filter we want to put on, and the pipework that goes down, we can print that up fine. But the scoop itself coming out from the bodywork and down off here, we might as well make that in some box section and just have it dropping down into the back of that. So that works quite nicely. So hopefully by the end of this episode, this is going to be attached onto the car, and we can put the bodywork across the top of here and down the sides as well, because the next bit of bodywork after that is the top of these wings. Now with those in, the back end of the car will be almost complete. So the first thing to do is add all the drainage channels around the back, so we'll start with that. Well, that was definitely not one of the most exciting pieces we've added, but the drip channels are now in, and we've added some thin sheet across the top here and then just beaten it round into a little curve, so we have a peak in the center and it will run down through this trough, down into the main trough on the side and off the back of the car. Next up, we're going to get something a little bit more exciting and start designing the bottom of the scoop. As we've got the top and the framework on, that's probably the next bit that we need to do. The scoop in the centre is made up of some inch flat bar and actually a little piece of tube that I cut some quarters out of and welded onto the top of this inch box. Now originally that was on some 1/2 inch that came across, and the whole thing was a little bit lower down. I've just lifted it to be a little bit bigger, and it does look a little bit better proportioned on the top of the car. Now we've obviously got the sheet in the very bottom here that you can see, and that forms the bottom edge of the scoop. Now, it's not completely flat where we've been welding through, but basically the top edge of this needs to come down and roll into the very back edge of this framework, and internally this needs to roll down, and this will probably have to be cut a little bit and bent down slightly so it gives a slightly better scoop, but we have got the roll cage running through the bottom. So it's not like this can just drop straight in, but we need to get this part in first, and then we can continue further out and add on the side panels out here. The first part of the scoop is in. Of course, you can see it's a little bit too big at the moment. There's no point it being this large because it doesn't need to duct into the top of the inlet on here. It needs to go right up to the far side where the MAF is. So I've bent up this piece of 0.8mm steel into a tube. Now, we welded down the top edge, flattened it down so it was nice and thin, same as the rest of the material. And then I've spent a little bit of time with a piece of scaffolding, effectively as a mandrel, just hammering it and hammering it and hammering it to get it a nice round shape. It's not quite there, but it's near enough for what we need, and a piece of silicone tube will absolutely seal onto this perfectly. Now, this is going to go on the far side, just about there, and go out, down, and we can put a panel filter enclosure, put a high flow panel filter in there, and it will go straight out down into the MAF. That will be all well and good. Now we need to cut this down, obviously, so in order to potentially have a window in the back, we want as much view out the back of here as possible. So this is going to be cut on a slope so that we still have this opening, but at this side where there's nothing, it's going to be a bit shallower. Similarly, at the top, it's going to have to come in on a bit of a slant because we've got the rear firewall coming all the way up to the back, and we need to work out how that's going to fit in around this as well. So after about 2 days of welding, grinding, welding again, sanding, cleaning up, everything else, this is the intake that's going to go onto the roof, or rather this is the roof with the intake attached. Now we've got a nice big wide opening here, and this opening is much bigger than the cross-sectional area of the pipe that's coming out of this side that goes down into the inlet. This is somewhere around the 90 square centimeters, and this is about 50, I think. So the next bit that we need to do, after I fill this little hole that I've just noticed, is put the top on. Now this is just going to seal it in and create the back, or the top plane, which will just fit on around here. So we'll get that welded on. The other bit that I've already added on is this 6mm rod around the front. Now that allows me to attach the bodywork to it without having to attach it directly onto this, so we can have two completely discrete skins. And it gives us what we need for the IVA test of a 2.5mm minimum radius on this inner panel. So this will actually be 3mm radius because it's a 6mm rod. So that's the last panel on the collector all done, from the intake down into the outlet that goes down into the inlet system for the car. Now, it hasn't quite come out perfectly. It has wobbled and it has put a big wave in across here, which isn't actually a problem and has kind of worked in my favour. Sort of to be expected with all of the heat being put in, welding it onto the framework, but it is what it is. However, it has made it so it doesn't flex at all. So this is one less panel that's going to be reverberating in the middle and need any damping. So I'll take that as a bit of a win. I've also added this 2-inch lip across the front, which is going to be the forward edge of the roof structure to take whatever we do with the roof. Now, there's a little part of me in the back of my mind that says I'd like to have a removable roof if I absolutely could. And even if I don't do that, I'm still going to need something to attach the rest of the roof onto at the front. So this went in now because it's a lot easier to weld in the underside of this while it's off the car than when it's on. And I'm trying to make the construction of this as easy as possible. He says, having never actually drawn it and is completely freewheeling it, but as easy as possible given that parameter. So the next bit I need to add on is the actual roof skin all the way across here from this rounded lip to each edge and to the very back lip across here. That's just going to be one piece of steel, hopefully, that's going to fit really nicely in. Now, after all that time spent welding, grinding, and just trying to make sure that this is going to fit right when we put it onto the car, this is what we have. You can see this is the underside of the intake with the outlet that goes down into the MAF and the intake into the engine. On this side, you've got the roof panel, which comes across the top of here. It has this really nice rolled edge. I like how this has come out. In the end, this is really nicely done. And I've also extended it down on each side, and I'll show you why in a second. If I can not beat the rest of the car up with this. As you can see, it's a little bit ungainly. On this side, I've added in a little flange that runs all the way from edge to edge, and this is to allow me to attach the top part of the firewall behind the driver's seat too. Now, because of where this is going to have to be welded in before this goes on the car, because I've got to get right up in around the back of the intake, which isn't going to be possible to get to when it's on the car. It's just going to be far too hard. Even if we flipped the car back over, it would still be a nightmare. So with that in mind, I've also extended the side panels down slightly and welded in a little stay down here for them to work around. This allows me to weld these side pieces onto the inside edge of that stay. I appreciate it's not very easy to see just because this is such an ungainly piece, but those had to go in before we put this onto the car, or before we weld this onto the car. So you can see how this fits in now. I'll just turn this over. That's quite heavy. So this now fits on really nicely. It's a good secure fit. It lines up nicely with the edges of the framework, both fore and aft, which is really good. Now, this body line that comes down here isn't the final one that we're going to have. This body line isn't going to drop off down the back of the car. It's actually going to continue down along a much lower sloped deck, which is going to come across the back. And this should all be made out of aluminium, which will keep the weight down, because this has turned out quite heavy with it being basically all steel in order to be practical to make. Now, we didn't quite manage to get this attached on this episode, but next time when we're working on the kit car, we are going to have this welded on, and I'm going to try and get the top of these rear arches installed properly and get them all welded in and blended into this. That way the whole back of the car is looking really, really good. We'll also hopefully have the exhaust all welded up, but if we don't, we'll get that done at some point, no doubt. And if you want to support us, have a look at shop.pedalbox.show. You can buy t-shirts like this. If you want to support us directly, you can go to patreon.com/pedalboxshow, and you can support us from as little as $1 a month. The $5 and $10 tiers do get access to our Discord server, and there are more benefits coming along as well. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel. The old YouTube metrics tell me only about a third of people that watch the channel are actually subscribed to it, which is incredible. So if more people can subscribe to it, hopefully the YouTube algorithm will start liking us more, pushing us further, and we can get even more people seeing our crazy projects. So thanks very much for watching. We'll see you next time.